Welcome you all. My name is Giovanni, and I'm the regional coordinator of the UNODC Global Program on Combating Wildlife and Forest Crime, based in Bangkok, Thailand, covering Asia. Welcome to this event, this webinar that is focused on law enforcement opportunities to combat wildlife crime in Asia. We're very glad to have many of you in this webinar, and we're very happy to have also a pool of very good experts that will share a little bit of their experience with you. The reason why we wanted to have this event is because, as you can all imagine, the last few months have brought the issue of wildlife to a new level of attention in the media, in the international community, and the issue of wildlife crime is now as topical than ever before. So it's important probably to clarify a few issues about wildlife crime. When we hear talking about wildlife crime and law enforcement, we very often hear things related to follow-up investigations, more arrest, more prosecution, follow the money kind of approaches, control delivery, eradicate corruption from the supply chain of the wildlife trade. But sometimes I wonder whether we really have a very good grasp of these topics. And in order to actually shed a little bit of light on the intricacies of these law enforcement matters, we have asked a number of law enforcement experts to come with us, to share their experience. Now, in this seminar, the focus will be purely on law enforcement. We are not suggesting that law enforcement is the only way, is the only solution to combat wildlife crime. But we want to focus on this one to understand how this solution can be a part of a broader solution. A broader solution involves certainly other elements, policies, legal frameworks, demand reduction, community engagement. They are all ingredients of a successful recipe to combat illegal wildlife trade. But at the same time, we should also try to understand a little bit better how law enforcement works. And when we talk about law enforcement in this webinar, we will really focus on criminal investigations against transnational organized crime. We will not talk about the offenses of people in a rural setup that try to provide with for the families. We're really trying to focus on the criminal structure, on the organized crime dimension of wildlife crime. So in this sense, we probably may also not touch much upon the issue of anti-poaching, for instance. So after clarifying what are the areas that we want to cover and what are the areas that we will not cover, I would like also to encourage you all to ask your questions in the chat box. I see that some of you have already started asking questions. During the registration process, many of you have already asked questions, which we have collected, we have analyzed, we have clustered in few groups, and we will use those questions, we will pose those questions to our experts, to our panelists. Now, without any further ado, I would like then to introduce the 5 panelists that we have with us. They are colleagues, they are friends with whom I always have very long conversation about wildlife crime, and I thought that actually it was very useful to expand a little bit the pool of people that we'll hear from these experts, hence this webinar. So the first expert of the day will be Alexandro Chachuloiu. He's the coordinator in Asia, the regional coordinator of the cybercrime program, and he brings with himself a wealth of experience in law enforcement, both from the Romanian National Police and with Interpol before actually joining UNODC. Alex, I'm very happy you're with us. The next presenter of the day will be Fabrizio Fioroni. Fabrizio also brings with him a huge amount of experience in law enforcement. He originally joined the Italian financial police before moving to Interpol, and then about a year ago joining UNODC to be the regional advisor of the global program on anti-money laundering. Thank you, Fabrizio, for being with us. We have then Stephen Carmody is the lead investigator of the Wildlife Justice Commission, relatively new but strong NGO that has really redefined a little bit the space in terms of investigations. And Steve brings with himself over 30 years of experience in law enforcement from the Australian Federal Police, other enforcement agencies in Australian states. He joined as a consultant, leading trainer UNODC more than 10 years ago, and now is the chief investigators for the Wildlife Justice Commission. We then have with us Valentina Pancheri. Valentina also joined UNODC a little bit less than a year ago, and she's the new regional coordinator for the program on border control. Very important program. She brings with her also a wealth of experience from law enforcement in Italy, and she was working before coming to Southeast Asia already in Central Africa with UNODC. And last but absolutely not least, our fifth speaker is Zhijiang Tao. My colleague, we work together in the global program for combating wildlife and forest crime. He brings with himself an experience mainly from the area of drug-related offenses. And he was actually part of the Chinese National Police before joining UNODC, first in his capacity as a drug control officer, and now more recently as in the wildlife program. So that's the group with whom we will talk over the next 60 minutes or a little bit more. And without any further ado, I would like now to pose the first question. And inevitably, it will be a question related to COVID and what are these restrictions related to travel, to transportation, how the impact of those restrictions have affected the volume, the extent of illegal wildlife trade, specifically from Asia. And I would like to ask Steve to take the floor for this first question.
Look, the last 6 months have seen some unprecedented set of circumstances unfold in relation to COVID. Like everyone, traffickers have been caught up in this as much as all of us. Early January, many Chinese and Vietnamese traffickers left Africa and went back home to celebrate Tet and Chinese New Year. And they were caught there, though. When travel restrictions were implemented, they were caught in Vietnam and China. So what we've seen is a slowdown in transnational trafficking, particularly with an African-Asian nexus. So if we're looking at, say, rhino horn, pangolin, and ivory, what we saw is a consolidation of these products in countries along the supply chain, whether that be in Africa itself, where we saw a marked drop in the price of ivory, or whether it be Malaysia or Thailand or Laos, Vietnam, and eventually these products would make their way into China. So we saw massive stockpiles of these products, particularly in, say, Vietnam, as products moved and then stopped when transport restrictions came into place. So, first obviously was affected with air freight and passenger freight. So you carry on luggage. Sea freight was less affected because many containers were still on the ocean and hadn't reached their destination when the travel restrictions were implemented. The land border between China and Vietnam was closed, and so obviously then we had issues with land transportation. So for several months, we had a situation where wildlife products weren't moving. They were sitting there, they were being stockpiled. And like everyone, wildlife traffickers were searching for money. They were searching for opportunities. We saw unprecedented levels of product being offered simply because of the fact that it was stuck. Obviously, the situation has changed now as travel restrictions have eased. Passenger carry-on is still an issue, but we're being told that the sea and air freight is back on, and as well as cargo moving across borders in trucks and in cars. But it was a remarkable time, and the amount of products that we were offered was unprecedented in the last 5 years.
Thank you, Steve, and that also should raise a sort of a red flag, meaning that as restrictions after the COVID are easing a little bit in Asia, there may be an implication that we will see a resurge of illegal wildlife trades over the next few months. And in part, you're saying it has already started already.
Yeah, that's right.
That's very good, Steve. Thanks, and we will get back to you on that. And now I wanted to understand a little bit, as we said, these goods require facilities from the transport system, required roads, and they go through border checkpoints. And inevitably, these are probably the bottlenecks where it is possible to identify and confiscate some of the illegal shipments. So in this sense, borders, and in particular land borders, are very relevant in Southeast Asia. So now, as the new regional coordinator of the border control program, I would like actually to ask Valentina if she can give us a little bit of a sense of what she thinks are the main movement of illegal wildlife shipments through the borders, and whether it is detected at all, whether border officers actually are looking for wildlife or they are not. And if you can shed a little bit of light on this issue.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. Greetings to all the participants connecting from the different time zones. I would like to thank you, Giovanni, for this opportunity, and especially for providing me with the opportunity of flagging the importance of land border posts in wildlife trafficking. As we all know, usually it is sea or air borders that are the main recipients of efforts from the international community, as well as the national authorities, and land border posts tend to be quite neglected. However, they have a huge role, especially as you mentioned, and as Steve mentioned, in transiting countries, when they reach the region, and then the flow of illicit wildlife has to reach the final destination. I would like now to share with our participants a brief PowerPoint. Hold on, let me see here, just to give you some here. Can you see it?
We get it. Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so this PowerPoint is just to show you what UNODC is doing in the region in Southeast Asia in relation to land borders. Since 1998, UNODC in partnership with the Southeast Asian governments has created the Border Liaison Office network. It counts over 100 locations. I will not bore you with the details, but basically what the aim of the BLO network is to strengthen national and cross-border coordination among law enforcement agencies in the fight against transnational organized crime. They are at the BLO, they sit mixed teams. We have border guards, narcotic agencies, we have immigration, customs. There is also forestry involved. I would like to show you a case study of Vietnam, where we have border liaison officers, and especially, I don't know if you see it here, but it's in the north part of Vietnam at the border with China. We have Vietnam is a key transit hub in the illicit wildlife trade poached in Africa and destined to Indonesia, Malaysian, and Chinese markets, among others. What we did is we compared the number of seizures and instances detected and investigated by the 4 Vietnamese BLO at the border with China, and between 2017 and 2019. To be honest, it was pretty impressive to see the amount of seizures regarding wildlife trafficking. We are talking about 231 cases involving wildlife, 9 pangolins, 429 kilograms of pangolin scales, 21 kilograms of rhino horns, 271 kilograms of illegal wood, and so on. Yet, this being said, the percentage of wildlife detected was only 23% of all the illicit trafficking detected at the 4 BLO locations, because 69%, so the highest percentage of detected illicit goods was drug, followed by wildlife, and then human trafficking. And we need to bear in mind that the corridor between Vietnam and China is a key corridor for wildlife trafficking. This is not the only example that I can provide you with in terms of the relevance of land border posts in the fight against illicit wildlife trafficking, yet the limited seizures and detection at land border post. As you mentioned, I worked at the regional office for West and Central Africa. And there I had the opportunity to work with countries, 6 countries, and organizing a law enforcement operation. And it was a massive exercise. So we had 619 officers involved, over almost 10,000 people searched the questions, yet the number of wildlife detected was 0. So this, I think, it's self-explainable and tells how much advocacy is still needed and sensitization is still needed at land border posts.
Thank you, Valentina. And you're touching on a crucial point, really, and it is whether or not frontline officers at the borders are actually even looking for wildlife. The border that you showed us, the one between Vietnam and China, is notorious for the volumes of illegal wildlife that might be moving across that border. And yet we see that inevitably the #1 priority for many of the frontline officers at the border is really drugs, and countering drug trafficking in this region. It helps you making a career, it helps you growing in the ranks of the organization. It's important to you and for your career. Maybe wildlife crime is not as important, it's not perceived as a crucial element. And that partly explains why we've seen much less seizures and operations related to wildlife than in other areas. Interesting that also in West and Central Africa, you've seen essentially the same issue, if not worse. So that's an element that we need to live with. With some of the panelists, we've been training frontline officers for many years, but still this issue is not really considered a priority. Now, I would like to move to the next panelist because we touched upon China. And I think that Tao probably can really help us to understand a little bit the issues related to China. It's pretty inevitable to talk about China when we talk about the movements of wildlife, because it's generally considered one of the biggest markets, if not the biggest market. But we also often tend to see China as a monolithic block where policies and law enforcement are part of the same environment, whereas in reality there are agencies in the government that set policies, agencies that set law enforcement, that intervene through law enforcement, and not always law enforcement is fully aware, even in China, of the implications of different policies. So maybe, Tao, can you walk us a little bit through what are the key agencies in China that are actually responsible for the investigations of wildlife crime? And also, can you tell us if in the past few months you have perceived a sort of increased attention by law enforcement on wildlife crime, as a result of COVID?
Sure, thank you, Giovanni. In China, the efforts to combat wildlife trade actually is coordinated by a inter-ministerial joint coordination mechanism. It is led by the National Forestry and Grassland Administration and consists of 25 different ministries. Everybody is doing their work according to their responsibilities. However, the major agency that is dealing with wildlife trade is within the authority of Anti-Smuggling Bureau of General Administration of China Customs. Now, it's a very unique agency. Why is that? Because they wear two hats. One, they are as functioning as the customs officer. The other hat that they're wearing, they are actually police officers as well. So they are doing the police work, but they are at the same time a customs officer. They are actually at the forefront of combating illegal wildlife trade in China. Now, in terms of the past few months, the challenges from the COVID and the stepping of law enforcement activities, yes, they do have a surge in the enforcement, in conducting more investigations and to dismantle more criminal networks. This is further proved by the news that we often received for the past few months. Even the latest one that we see is the one that we heard 3 days ago, where China has made a huge seizure of ivory and rhino horns, 143 kilos, if I'm not wrong, in a single case where the network was entirely brought down because of the investigation was conducted and coordinated by the Anti-Smuggling Bureau of China Customs. This is also a proof to the situation that was analyzed just now by Steve. Those traffickers that dealing with the wildlife trade from Africa part, where they supply the wildlife products to China, was actually caught in the lockdown in this COVID situation. The customs authorities, the Anti-Smuggling Bureau, they took the advantage of the lockdown and brought them all back to justice for the seizures that they've done.
Okay, Tao, thanks. I think that we clarified a lot of potential misconception also related to the work that is happening in China. And I think that also during the course of this webinar, we will learn that actually Chinese law enforcement probably conduct sometimes operations and investigations that don't really reach the media, the public attention, but sometimes are quite effective. And later we'll get back to that. But now, as we have been talking essentially about how this crime operates in a structural fashion with some degree of organization and some degree of division of labor within a criminal network, it's also important to understand how to tackle this kind of setup, this kind of organization, not only through physical interceptions of wildlife, not only through seizures, but through more advanced forms of investigation that are available to law enforcement, that are used generally in other forms of crimes, maybe drug trafficking, terrorism, and try to understand whether these investigation techniques can be, in a sense, borrowed also in this sector, specifically in the field of illegal wildlife trade, and see whether law enforcement authorities can implement these sort of measures. One that is certainly famous and mentioned many times is related to the financial investigations related to illegal wildlife trade. The trail of money can be very different from the trail of the physical goods moving from one continent to the others, but the flow of money can go completely in a different direction. Eventually, that money will have to reach, in a sense, the person that is on top of the criminal network, the person who will benefit the most from this criminal enterprise. So we want to move now to Fabrizio as an expert in money laundering and financial investigations to understand why in Southeast Asia there has been so little experience and so little success. We can really count in the fingers of one hand the number of cases where a seizure of wildlife actually successfully led to a follow-up financial investigations. What do you think it can realistically be done in Southeast Asia to change the status quo?
Thank you very much, Giovanni, and greetings to all the participants from myself as well. Yeah, it is true that in Southeast Asia, there is not so much experience in conducting financial investigations related to illegal wildlife trade, but this is actually true in all other continents of the globe. There has been a very recent research from the Financial Action Task Force, which is the global center for international standards against money laundering. And I have to say, thanks to the Chinese presidents, that this global sector of international standards have focused recently on wildlife trafficking, because previously no one other presidency have never given priority to this predicate offense for money laundering. The final results of this research will be published soon, but a first overview of what has been done so far more or less reflects what UNODC did also a few years ago, because UNODC also made a research 3 years ago on money laundering or financial investigations in wildlife against wildlife trafficking. And the situation was quite scary because seemingly no countries at all, it seemed like, were really conducting financial investigations. And it is true that when UNODC made this research, most typically the financial intelligence unit, which are those law enforcement agencies or administrative agencies that can provide real support on investigations against wildlife, have really nearly never been used. Now the situation is changing a little bit because of the priority over wildlife is improving, thanks to the Chinese presidency, as I said before. But what can be done now is to understand, as you said before, how to follow the money, because it has been mentioned many times that following the money is an opportunity for law enforcement agency to understand how criminal organizations are structured and how they operate. It is also true that provides a lot of opportunity to understand where the assets are located, so that they can be eventually seized and confiscated, because that's a very good way or strategic way to disrupt criminal organizations. Because we have seen in the past also from other criminal offenses or other predicate offenses, like for drug trafficking, for example, that organized crime groups are very flexible, but they can, if you only focus on the human resources or on their logistics, like, for example, if you keep arresting the associates or the partners, or you seize vehicles, or you seize a small warehouse, but you don't seize the financial assets of the kingpins, of the masterminds behind the criminal organization, that criminal organization will replicate again basically the same offenses. It's a very good opportunity for law enforcement agency in Southeast Asia, Asia in general, and globally, really to implement more effective financial investigations. There is also there is a requirement for more actors to be involved, obviously, because when it comes to financial investigations, the topic can become quite complex, because you can have in the wildlife trafficking trade, you can have small retailers, but you can have a very big organization providing or supplying the big market. You can imagine if wildlife parts are used for bigger markets, like for example pharmaceuticals, or for creating clothes, or for food, for whatever. Obviously, they are usually structured in a complex way. Our experience suggests that they can be placed in several jurisdictions. They usually use, they can use also shell companies set up in offshore jurisdictions, which really makes the job of financial investigators or investigators in general very, very difficult. So the question also is not just what follow the money probably means, but we should also understand who should follow the money, because not necessarily is always the same law enforcement agency that will deal with seizing the containers at the border, or probably arresting the poachers in the source countries, but probably you will have a skilled financial investigators that should support this kind of inquiries. This is also understandable if we go back to the video that you showed before about activities of trainings. When you provide trainings for DNA examination or collecting DNA samples, that's something that you need for very skilled investigators. And the same thing should apply for financial investigators. And in UNODC, we promote a kind of training of, we are aiming to provide trainings to ideally professionalize a financial investigator. And because we want to make sure that who is going to deal with financial investigations will have a clear understanding of all the processes that goes from the way the criminal organization raise the funds, the way they use it, the way they move the money, and how and where they store it.
Okay, Fabrizio, I think you covered and you touched upon some crucial crucial elements related also to who are the agencies that really are in charge of conducting those advanced investigations. And that's a point on which I would like to get back to you, especially when we talk about capacity building, because there is a high risk of teaching the right skills to the wrong agencies, to the wrong people. So the elements that you highlighted is really crucial. And we now want to hear also about another form of non-traditional investigation, if you like, which is more related to the cybercrime space. That is an area that certainly many wildlife traditional investigators are not necessarily familiar with. So I would like to ask Alex, how do you think, Alex, that actually cybercrime investigations can practically help wildlife agencies to crack down some of the organized structures that are in place? Are the wildlife agencies actually the right agencies to investigate cybercrime? How do you think the law enforcement could really put a dent on organized crime through the angle of cybercrime?
Hi, Giovanni. Thank you for having me here, and thank you for all the participants. Yeah, I think it's a very relevant question, and I think we have to make first the distinction between cybercrime and transnational organized crime. So when we generally speak about cybercrime, we think about highly advanced techniques. We talk about very tech-savvy criminals that usually go after servers or after data that is hosted on the network somewhere. So we talk about highly complex investigations. And when I think about the support that cybercrime can bring to wildlife crime, I don't think about that specific type of crime, but I think about the fact that we all use technology and criminals use technology as well. So since wildlife crime is a form of transnational organized crime, we have to go with the same mindset in approaching this crime. So we need to have a very complex unit that has a complex toolkit, right? From being able to do traditional investigations and control deliveries and stakeouts and so on, to the more specialized areas such as financial investigations and online investigations. So we can now do a lot more, gather a lot more data just by sitting behind a computer with an internet connection, right? We can gather a huge amount of information about our targets. And traditionally, I think that wildlife crime is being sold online on a lot of forums, on a lot of social media, and on online chat applications and so on. So I think that wildlife crime investigators should have the skills necessary to go out there on those platforms and identify perpetrators or gather evidence. And that's not to say that they should be highly skilled cyber investigators, being able to identify, servers and do very technical investigations. But they should understand that everything that we do leaves traces online, and there are degrees of skills. I think first level of skill, I think they could have the ability to do these online investigations and understand where to gather this evidence. If they need more specialized skill, if we have, they have to deal with more technical crime. And now we see the next level after selling wildlife crime on social media or other forums is going on to the darknet, right? Being able to operate in the darknet requires a lot higher level of skills than just being able to gather evidence from an online medium. So that's where maybe you need to have wildlife crime units working closely together with maybe cybercrime units that have more dedicated set of skills. This is one part of the online evidence that I think it's useful for wildlife crime. The second one is the digital evidence that is obtained forensically from the criminals, right? So this is evidence that's obtained after the operation has been done. So once they're able to do this operation and seize the wildlife crime, the illegal contraband, they will find digital evidence on those criminals, whether they're mobile phones, computers, laptops, or now wearable devices, Fitbits, iWatches, and so on. There is a huge amount of evidence on these devices, and here I don't think that necessarily wildlife crime investigators should have the skills to analyze this evidence, but they should have the minimum skills to know how to identify and properly package, seize this evidence, and take it to a specialized lab that is able to analyze it. And when they take it to this specialized lab, they should have the skill, they should understand what kind of evidence they find there. And once they get a report back, they should know how to interpret this evidence and maybe provide, put together the pieces of the puzzle to understand the case that they have. And here we have, for example, I want to mention the digital forensic lab that we set up in Laos, right? And both of our programs, me and Giovanni's, we worked on that. We've identified that there have been a number of cases that wildlife crime investigators seized along with wildlife crime, with wildlife products, digital evidence. There was no specialized place where they could take this evidence to be analyzed. So we set up this digital forensic lab. We train those people, provide them with the dedicated equipment, and they can use this skill for all type of investigations, not only wildlife crime, right? Now we have the capacity to analyze the evidence, and I think this is kind of in a nutshell what I want to say. More than happy to hear questions or link up later.
Absolutely, Alex. We'll get back to this, because just like also Fabrizio mentioned, you also mentioned that there is a need of build on the specializations within the law enforcement agencies, and it's probably not very useful to try to upgrade some wildlife investigators to become cybercrime experts, to become financial investigation experts, or to be able to carry out really advanced investigations, when in reality their background, their training is probably different. So it's important to understand what are the agencies that we are dealing with, and what is the crime that we are dealing with. Now, that leads me to Steve, who often shares his view on how organized is really organized crime in the wildlife sector? Are we really talking about a top-notch level, top-notch kind of criminal networks, or it's actually a little bit less than that?
Yeah, thanks, Giovanni. Look, although many of the groups that are operating within Southeast Asia would meet the legal definition of organised crime, I would characterise them as disorganised crime. We just don't see the level of sophistication in wildlife crime that we see in other crime types, such as drugs, for example. Their tradecraft is poor. They don't change their phone numbers for years. They have open Facebook accounts, many of these guys and girls. They don't practice anti-surveillance, and if they do, they're not very good at it. They meet multiple customers at the same restaurants or bars. They openly flaunt their wealth. They rarely, if ever, question a UC's legend or their associates, and they often provide documentation supporting their criminal activities. And they love to big note themselves. We just don't see this same sort of behaviour with traditional organised crime groups, say the mafia or the Yakuza or triads. We just don't see that. What we're seeing in wildlife crime are people that are either terrible criminals and have been incredibly lucky, or they are completely confident in their corrupt connections, and law enforcement is just not an issue for them. But operationally, they're very, very poor.
And that's a point that is important, because it seems to be, I don't particularly like to talk in these terms, but it seems to be an enemy that is not that strong. It's an enemy that can be, in a sense, defeated if there was a little bit more organization also on the side of law enforcement. Now, from what we're saying, Valentina, we hear that there is a need of also considering law enforcement not as a monolithic block, but as the sum of different agencies, different departments with different skills that need to work where really their added value is, and then try to build a national and possibly regional or even global response. So what do you think at the border really needs to happen to make sure that the land borders in Southeast Asia in particular become a little bit more of an obstacle for those that are actually moving illegally wildlife goods across borders?
Okay, so yes, land borders in Southeast Asia, as they are also all over the world, it's not a problem per se in Southeast Asia, are very porous. Frontline officers at borders, especially in Southeast Asia, they battle with a very high volume of trucks, of vehicles passing through the borders, and the need of being efficient. There are formal border crossings, and nearby there are informal ones. What we can do to overcome that? So for sure, it's not possible to have to be able to patrol all borders because of the geography location. Some borders, I mean, there are, there's jungle, there are no roads, so it's not possible to go there. However, what we can do is not to strengthen only cross-border coordination, which is of course needed in this type of matters, but also national coordination. It is paramount for the policy level to take the issue of wildlife crime and to make it, as important as the technical at the technical level. It is impossible, as we said, for the forestry to be present at the border. They don't need to be present at the border, but it's very important to coordinate and to have coordination meetings happening between the provincial level and the land border level, so that everybody is kept abreast about new modus operandi, trafficking, etc. So again, the need for coordination, especially in an environment where TPOPs are usually the way forward for the identification rather than simple road checks.
Yeah, and actually you also touch upon a key issue, which is the issue of corruption and lack of transparency in many areas of public officials that actually may even facilitate the illegal trade of wildlife. And many of the questions that actually we have received in the past during the registration process were very much focused on corruption. And I wonder how actually law enforcement can really address this issue of fighting corruption within its own ranks, but also among government officials that are not necessarily part of the law enforcement. And presumably also financial investigations can be a particular tool. Can you, Fabrizio, probably help us a little bit to understand how financial investigations can actually be a useful tool, a useful ally in the fight against corruption in the wildlife trade?
Yes, obviously corruption is a huge barrier for any kind of investigation. And besides obviously taking steps like investigating it, the first things that law enforcement agencies should do themselves is like to understand their own risk for internal corruption that they have. And the first thing to do is like to taking transparency policies to be fully implemented and all kind of possible protection of their own agencies to be exposed to corruption. Then what can be done, that's also corruption, to go back to the title to this webinar, is an opportunity actually for investigation sometimes. Because if when it comes to running a financial investigation for wildlife offenses, sometimes if you need cooperation, let's say for a foreign jurisdiction, maybe because you need more information from other countries, you might find difficulties because wildlife is not a priority offense over there, while actually corruption might well be. And obviously, if you do investigate either a high-ranking official involved in a major wildlife trade scheme, or either a small officer, let's say in a front-line officer, you should take different steps, obviously. You can expect that the frontline officers probably are bribed for a few amounts in cash occasionally when it's needed, while you might have very well positioned high-ranking officials which might be able to, within the whole criminal justice system, which might be able to really undermine the results of an investigation. So law enforcement agencies involved in this kind of job, they should really understand what's needed to get rid of this huge barrier. Something that should be done. There are some good examples also in the region here. It's obviously to understand when a high-ranking official might have some unexplained wealth. As Steve obviously he mentioned before, that some people really is not taking steps to hide how rich they became because of these criminal offenses, and also to build strong relationship from the wildlife perspective and thinking with anti-corruption commission or agencies which are built within the country. That's obviously a needed step. So interagency cooperation in country is fundamental.
And that's a very good point for a huge challenge. It probably does remain the biggest challenge for law enforcement. The role of corruption in the illegal wildlife trade cannot be overemphasized. And there is also a way of combating corruption, if you will, that is based on conducting joint operation, in particular international cooperation. It's a very powerful way of trying to bring also transparency to a trade and try to identify where there are weaknesses in a specific supply chain. So the role of international cooperation among law enforcement agencies is always crucial, is one of the most important elements. And I would like to know from Tao, what do you think that actually could be, or at the moment are, the main barriers to an effective law enforcement cooperation in Southeast Asia, but also between law enforcement agencies in Asia and those maybe in Africa, since the link, the flow of wildlife products between Africa and Asia is quite crucial.
Thank you, Giovanni. Yes, as you said, international joint operation is very crucial to combat this type of crime, as the nature of wildlife trafficking from Africa to Asia, or across the borders in Asia, or between China and Vietnam sometimes. This always involve different countries where different law enforcement agencies have to work together to share information, to communicate better, to launch joint investigations, to collect evidence, to a lot of investigation techniques to share, so that to well establish the network to combat this type of crime. Now, the challenges that we see in the past for this type of cooperation to take place, first thing that, in my personal opinion, is the political will. Law enforcement agencies, often the case in different countries, has different practice, but they often take from orders or priorities that was set already by the supervision or by their policymakers. They have different priorities at different times, and sometimes wildlife is not actually one of their priorities to look into, and that will pose challenges for international cooperation. And there's also challenges lies in sheer actionable intelligence. When a case happens in one country on a case-to-case basis, then those kind of information, are they flowing to the right agency in the other country? And then complete response from the other country are given because they have the right jurisdiction to do it. This is also a question. Will those information flow actually to the right agency that can deal with it? Often the case, we have the information, we have the good intent to share. However, the responding agency is not the right one to do it in their own country. So it is crucial for countries to work together to establish a network with the right people on the right platform to conduct the right joint investigations. We have a lot of failures in the past, and also we have huge success as well. We made along the way from our standpoint that a joint investigation could be well performed.
Yeah, and we have seen also in our line of work some success stories of cooperation where information is shared informally between law enforcement agencies in one country or another. Sometimes even police to customs or customs to police through informal direct communication between officials that sometimes meet in international conferences, international workshops, and they exchange telephone numbers and they start to communicate with each other when that is the need, when there is a need. But we can't also underestimate the importance of formal communication. And we're working in a space in which there are mechanisms for country and law enforcement agencies to actually cooperate, to work together. But still, countries don't always make full use of these very powerful tools. So, Steve, in your experience, also with some investigations on transnational crime that you've seen related to wildlife in particular, what do you think could happen, should happen, to try to strengthen more the effectiveness of cooperation among law enforcement agencies at international level?
Yeah, thanks, Giovanni. Particularly in Southeast Asia at the moment, there seems to be a seize and post mentality. So if you're working a transnational case and a transit country or even the destination country has an agency that seizes the product, what we often see in Southeast Asia is within hours of that seizure, a media release from that law enforcement agency standing in front of the wildlife saying that, hey, look how good we are. We've just seized these 3 containers of ivory or pangolin. What should be happening is, upon that seizure, they should be contacting the source country, or they should be contacting the destination country and developing an investigative strategy, whether that be a controlled delivery or a substitution, or at least doing something proactive to enhance that investigation. A seizure without an investigation is useless. All we've lost is the wildlife. The seizure either needs to represent the end phase of an investigation where you go and arrest everyone, or the beginning phase of an investigation where you need to start tracing back to see, who was responsible for sending it, who's going to get it, where's the money flows. So at the moment, what we're seeing is it's a disconnect. And a lot of that comes back to intelligence analysis, or should I say, a complete lack of intelligence analysis. There's very little intelligence analysis going on in this field. And because there's no analysis, there's no sharing of the intelligence picture. We know who many of the main players are, but these people are surrounded by other people that support them, whether they be corrupt lawyers or accountants, whether they be, the person who facilitates the transportation or who's the person that pays the money. These networks need to be approached transnationally. So not just within that one country, but multiple countries. And some of our speakers have mentioned that. The people who may do the money laundering investigation may not be any of the countries involved in the seizure. So what we need to do is we need to share this intelligence and share this evidence and communicate and get ahead of the criminals, make them start, get into their decision cycle, make them react to us for a change instead of us reacting to them. And to me, that's one of the biggest issues within Southeast Asia. It's a reactive mindset from law enforcement rather than a proactive mindset. They're not targeting criminal networks. They're reacting to what the criminal networks are doing. So we're only seeing a fragment of the intelligence picture. And this is where I believe that, we've trained for many years, and yet we're still not seeing the results of that training. I think we need to have a long, hard look at that training. Are we training the right things? Are we seeing multiple agencies, IGOs, NGOs, training different source materials to the same units? There's no standardization. There's no one that owns the curriculum for this training. So are we also contributing to the problem? So, there needs to be a start somewhere. Is that the training? Are we, should we move on from training and put mentors in vetted units? And then we see a much greater sharing and exchange of information. There's quite a few things, obviously, that need to be done, but they're not very big things. It won't take much of a change to turn this around and start seeing these networks being dismantled.
And Steve, you touched really upon some very important points related also to capacity building and whether actually we are all doing any good to the cause by keep on training people that, as I said, may be the wrong people to be trained. Maybe we're not really looking into the right way of conducting training. Maybe we should switch to more permanent forms of capacity building beyond the one-off training courses. But again, it's essentially we need to stop asking ourselves the question, who are we training, why are we training, and what are really the expectations of what these people can do after are being trained. And we all have a little bit of homeworks to do in terms of looking into our program, whether we are donors or international organizations or NGOs or government agencies. everybody seems to like training courses, but there is a question that needs to be asked on whether these training courses are actually producing the expected results. One could argue that it doesn't hurt to train more people, but at the same time, we are dealing in a world with limited resources, and we need to understand whether these resources are being put in the right place. And so your question is crucial, and I think that it resonates well with what Fabrizio and Alex have already mentioned on the fact that we don't necessarily need to train a wildlife agency to do financial investigations or cybercrime. There are specialized agencies for that. Let's rather have them working together, and that's a crucial point. The importance of being able to conduct analysis. Not a single investigators can do analysis on all the different crime types. So. And this leads me to the question that I wanted to ask earlier on to Alex, and the fact that in terms also of proactive investigation, Steve was telling us how law enforcement here is very reactive, but how a proactive approach is crucial to anticipate crime, to determine where crime might happen before it happens, and certainly. The online trade is a very accessible indicator of where the main criminal activities are. We've heard also from some of the questions that there are a lot of negotiations going on social media, and then there is when the first contact is established, maybe there is a switch to phone apps to conduct more advanced discussion, maybe to exchange also payments. How do you think that actually social media can play a role to support also law enforcement in specifically in relation to wildlife crime? Do you think that law enforcement should be able to actually identify potential market places online, and how that would impact bigger pictures of privacy and human rights?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good question. I mean, we see that social media is extremely active in working with law enforcement in online child abuse, for example. That's a good example, because a lot of child abuse material is also hosted, uploaded on social media. And social media is taking very active steps, some companies more than others, in identifying this material and flagging it and taking down those accounts. I think in wildlife crime, it might be slightly more difficult, at least at the moment, because obviously social media is used by a lot of people for a lot of commercial reasons, right? A lot of people are posting and selling a lot of stuff. Clothing, all types of equipment, and I don't know, medication and so on. Whether that is regulated or not in each country, that depends. But I think it's, at the moment, at least from my point of view, is very hard to get social media to take a proactive role in identifying these products. There might be some interesting discussions that could be started with social media providers around that. But I think once you have that, then people will just move towards different platforms, I think. And we see also in the drugs trade, there's a lot of online drugs trade on traditional online platforms, on social media, on forums, on chat applications. And so just posting stuff online essentially is not a crime. So it's hard to just take down sell ads and stuff. So I think what needs to happen is wildlife crime investigators should get better at identifying where these platforms are, where they can find this content, and how to gather data about these people. Because just posting stuff online and having it taken down by social media, I don't think we're gonna get to that point. Social media companies have a huge interest in getting people on the platform, not off the platform. And as I said, just posting something online, unless it's of course child abuse material, which in itself is a crime in a lot of countries around the world. So wildlife illegal wildlife being posted online, I think might be hard to be in itself a crime to have it taken down. And once you take it down, these people will just migrate to a different platform. So I think the answer should be maybe get investigators more accustomed to this type of online investigations. Maybe if you want to call it cyber patrolling, know where to find these data, know how to talk to the people and gather evidence and get to the bottom of the network in the end. And as the other speakers mentioned, it's essentially transnational organized crime investigation. So you need to have multiple skills combined into a unit that does this type of work. I think that, and obviously the answer to wildlife crime is not going to be primarily an investigative one. It's more of a supply and demand. There are multiple aspects involved. But I think once you make the transition from investigating this in a reactive way and as just, something happened at the border, we managed to seize something and that's it, towards more of a specialized transnational organized crime type of investigation, then you will need to upskill this unit with proper skill, proper equipment, and also connect them to the proper agencies in the country that can help, right? Because wildlife crime investigators can't handle all the parts of this.
Yeah, exactly. And Alex, there are so many questions that I would like to ask you as a follow-up, because the topic is so urgent and so current and so important. But at the same time, I see that we have only 20 minutes left before the end of this webinar, and there are a number of questions that have been asked by the audience, and I would like to try to address at least some of them. Apologies in advance if we can't take all of them. It's really a lot of questions that have reached us. I don't know whether I should take it as an indicator of interest or the fact that you are suggesting that our speakers are saying very wrong things, but let's take some that I've already seen, and it's mainly related to financial investigation, and it's asking why, in a sense, law enforcement agencies in Asia are somehow reluctant to share financial information, and why cooperation on financial investigations are somehow weak in Asia, and what could be done for educating law enforcement agencies about the importance of doing this kind of identifying the suspect names, the banking records, and all the financial information. I think that this question falls squarely in your space, Fabrizio. So if really in 2 to 3 minutes you can give an answer, because we'll move then to the next question. In the meantime, I ask all the speakers to look at the questions that have been published, because we'll try to address them now.
Yeah, okay, I will try to answer in a full way. Regarding why law enforcement agencies doesn't give back information, that's probably because of legislative restrictions, obviously. There are very few examples where the public-private partnerships work so openly when it comes to financial data. There is a very good example from United Kingdom, from UK, where usually financial institutions, they sit together at the same table with law enforcement agencies and they discuss about targets or suspects, and they can freely share information about who is going to be investigated, what's the information held by each different financial institution or bank, and also from the law enforcement agencies. But that requires a very open legislation and some probably reform in the laws which are in place in the countries in Southeast Asia. But nevertheless, who is passing information? Who is probably the question is coming from Western Union, if I'm not wrong.
Yes.
A similar question, yeah. So usually money value transfer services like Western Union are part of a very big, let's say, a very big mechanism against money laundering. No, and they have some requirement where they should be. They're supposed to recognize when there is a suspicious transactions going on within their system. And they are part of this system, but the legislation doesn't foresee that the information goes back, though it is promoted that feedbacks are provided at the end of the investigations or inquiries, also to the originator of the information. In this case, could be Western Union. And this is something that should be certainly improved. It doesn't require reform in the legislation, because giving a feedback, like providing feedbacks to Western Union from usually the financial intelligence unit, saying that amongst all the information you provided us, a number of investigations started without providing too much details. That's something that certainly can be improved. Then I don't remember the second part of the question. For cooperation, why is so weak? That unfortunately, that's a little bit common, because I hope the participants understand that already cooperation in country is difficult. Sometimes it's difficult even to have cooperation within the same agency from different departments. So you can imagine that when it comes to international cooperation, these usually barriers are amplified. So there are several steps, but organizations like UNODC usually are placed to also improve this kind of cooperation. We facilitate the informal exchange of information, because we put in contact stakeholders from different countries, and I think this can be improved. And this is also important, as Giovanni mentioned before, because it's also a result from usually capacity buildings that we deliver at regional level, where we put together different law enforcement agencies from different countries. So in this way, they start building networks.
Thank you. I think you answered the question, and of course, doing financial investigation is difficult, and you can't teach it easily. It takes, I think that also, Fabrizio, for you, it took many years of practice before becoming a good financial investigator. So clearly, it's a different line of professionals, and again, we just repeat the same topic that we said before. Training on this line of work is complex. Fabrizio, you want to add something?
That's I would like to add. This is something I mentioned before. That UNODC is also supporting the idea of creating professional financial investigators, so to provide a career for a financial investigator within the countries in Southeast Asia, so that no matter what is the related criminal offense, can be drugs trafficking or wildlife trafficking or illegal logging, but you will know that there is a professional financial investigator fully dedicated to that kind of investigations in your country.
Thank you, Fabrizio. And I see another question that basically they are asking how essentially can we increase the profile of this crime and to become more or less a national security issue. This question mentions a sort of a convergence of different crimes, whereby together with wildlife crime, we see money laundering, corruption, public health issues, of course, we've seen recently. How do you think, Steve, that it is possible to somehow increase the profile of these crimes to national security issues? There are countries like South Africa, if I'm not mistaken, that are already considering wildlife crime as a national security issue. How can that lesson be replicated in other countries, for instance? Would you have an idea, Steve?
Gio, like anything, law enforcement needs to be incentivized to do this. And that comes basically in three ways. The first way, political will. So if politicians say that this is a national security issue and law enforcement is to treat it as such, well, then you'll see a change in the prioritization of this crime type. Obviously then another method is to give them more funding or access to seized assets. So if this wants to become a national security issue, well, then you need to fund it. Investigations of these type, even investigating disorganized crime costs money. Criminals don't work 8 to 4 Monday to Friday. So if you're going to work these type of crimes, and particularly if it's going to be a national security crime type, you then need to resource it. You know, people need to work overtime, they need to work weekends, they need to have the appropriate vehicles to do surveillance. You know, just have a look at the resources that we currently put into terrorism and then compare it to wildlife crime. It just doesn't compare. So you're talking a massive paradigm shift in allocation of resources to law enforcement. You know, if you're going to treat this as a national security issue. At the end of the day, we're starting to see the emergence of these, you know, of COVID and the zoonotic diseases, and just have a look at the amount of people that have died from COVID-19. It's more people than have died from terrorism between now and 2001. So, you know, I honestly think that post-COVID, we are going to see a change in law enforcement approach to wildlife crime. I think it's inevitable that we see that. I think governments must take it much more seriously. And if they do, well, then we'll see it treated as a national security issue, and hopefully more resources are allocated to it. I think it's also important to say, like, whilst the five of us have been talking, that, you know, there have been successes in the field of wildlife crime investigations and enforcement. We have seen massive advances over the last 3 years, especially. You know, so whilst you know, it may appear that we're talking doom and gloom here, there are some excellent examples of outstanding police work, outstanding work by prosecutors to put good traffickers before the courts. We just want to see more of it, and we would like to see, you know, a much greater emphasis on cooperation to tackle transnational organised crime rather than just domestic crimes.
Yes, and Steve, I think that it's very nice that you mention also the success stories. Again, I think that many of us and many of the people in the audience as well have been working in this space for a long time, and the level of attention that we see now for wildlife issues, on wildlife crime related issues, is not comparable to what it was 10 or 15 years ago, when the level of attention was really, really low. These came with some successes, but I think that I've seen some of the comments in the chat box. These successes have also been pretty slow. We would have expected, we would have hoped for a faster way of catching up with these crimes, especially because, as you said, Steve, we're talking really about slightly disorganized crime. It's not really the most powerful drug cartel Latin America that we're talking about. We're talking about a group that manages to move, well, some groups that manage to move natural resources quite easily from one country to a country, from a continent to the other continent, but taking on them shouldn't also be that difficult with the right political will. Both you and Tao are stressing how much law enforcement, in a sense, reacts also to what comes from above, to what comes from politicians, from executives, and that's a crucial element. But everybody always talks about political will, but I always wonder, how does that political will change? I mean, it's part of what we do, frankly. It's part of our work to engage with heads of agencies, government, to try to change that political will. But any of you among the speakers would like to add some suggestions on how to change the political will? Tao, I think that you actually mentioned that the COVID and the health emergency really had triggered a different reaction on the Chinese government, and in a trickle-down effect also on law enforcement. Do you mind elaborate on that?
Yes, that's true. COVID has posed a great health threat not only to China, because assumably started from a seafood market in Wuhan. However, this became a global pandemic and then brought back to the people to reconsider, to reposition, and to understand how this wildlife trade can actually threaten the health of humankind. That message actually delivered to the top level in China, where the president understands the situation, and then the political will is very naturally generated. With that political will, law enforcement will have definitely more resources, more tools to look into, and also that is a priority. If that is a priority, then the law enforcement can exert their resources and then do investigations and do more commitment and achievements. That will bring the different and more favorable results in terms of fighting against wildlife trafficking. That is why political will is so important. As a former police officer, we went to the office. We have a list. We have our priorities. Unfortunately, in the past, wildlife trafficking is not on the top list. Now, thanks, I'm not sure if this is a good thing, but we owe to the outbreak of COVID. This become a top priority for China and also for other countries in the region, and that brings back more strong law enforcement activity and bring more results. So one in all, that is a good sign, and we hope that this political will last, and then give more resources for the law enforcement to combat in line with those political will, more efficient, the wildlife trafficking. That is very crucial.
Thank you, Tao. Again, I mean, the lack or the lax approach of law enforcement to many of the issue and the limited international cooperation is manifested very often by a lack of information that is shared. There are many examples, and I think that one of the participants, audience from Singapore, did mention how sometimes the information is shared, but there is no feedback coming from the countries that receive that information. And that is frustrating, certainly on the side of those that actually share information. And Land Borders, I think Valentina is very much struggling and trying as much as possible to collect information on seizures that can inform other enforcement agencies on what are the trends. We've talked a lot about the importance of criminal intelligence, the importance of conducting intelligence analysis to understand where the crime is going, how it is mutating, whether it's going through certain border areas or others. But Valentina, I know how much it's difficult to collect good quality information from borders. With you, we can talk about land borders, but I think that also other borders, seaports and airports, probably a little bit less, but struggle with the same problems. What do you think, Valentina, can be done to increase the amount of information sharing among law enforcement agencies that at least can share information on seizures, which is probably the starting point for some real post-seizure investigations?
Yes, so thank you for this question. Is very relevant. The importance of data collection is key. We always speak about the problem, but sometimes it is difficult to quantify how big the problem is, especially because we don't have stats from the governments. It is also true that even as in the BLO network, it is not always necessarily easy to get information out of the BLOs. It becomes even more complicated when there are more law enforcement agencies at the border, and each is basically has a different role. What would be really helpful would be to have the coordination meetings at land borders with actual law enforcement agencies who operate at the borders, where there is a platform that can be created and there is a lead agency that is able to get information and numbers out of all the different actors playing at the borders. It is also true that especially the international community plays a role in, if we can say, sometimes making things complicated. There are a lot of different information systems that are placed for data collection and are introduced. And however, land borders are often in remote locations, don't necessarily have internet, the officers at the border are not necessarily IT literate. So there is that factor to take into account. What I would suggest is do less and do it better. So try to gather this information without using systems that necessarily create more confusion than a positive environment.
Thank you. Thank you, Valentina. I'm now in this very difficult position because we have new questions that keep coming. They're all interesting. We have so much that we could discuss, but our time is essentially coming to an end. We have published some of these questions, not even 30% of the questions that are coming. We've managed to publish. I was intrigued now by a couple of questions related to, for instance, non-formal law enforcement criminal justice system approaches, what the speakers think about non-formal law enforcement criminal justice systems. I don't know exactly what that means, but probably some of the speakers have an opinion on that. But maybe it's more unofficial law enforcement. But that's if any of the speakers want to answer on that. And then we have also our dear friend from Nigeria asking whether if in a sense the regulations of the international treaties don't pose a disincentive for wildlife traffickers, can there be like political, in a sense, measures against countries that don't manage to combat wildlife crimes adequately? Can we have heads of law enforcement to show stronger commitment to wildlife crime? And if countries don't show commitment, can then be some sort of penalties, in a sense, by international structures? Now, both very relevant question. Probably we won't touch on your question, Abimbola. I'll be happy to talk to you more about that. But is any of the speakers, as the very last question, want to say anything about the non-formal law enforcement?
I think the question refers to an informal public-private partnership with law enforcement and criminal justice system, if I understood the source of the question. I think we touched a little bit on this discussion. Obviously, there is need for better cooperation between, for example, civil societies or NGOs and other public entities, of course, with law enforcement agencies, because sometimes they do possess very, very actionable information and intelligence, which are not already known to law enforcement agencies. That's obviously a good way for starting investigations. Now, also going back to when you start this, is not always the case that the law enforcement agency will share back the results of any investigation or if there has been any investigation. That's because of the restrictions from the existing legislation. And that goes back to the political will to improve a little bit, because obviously if there is a way to provide back the feedback to the source of the information, obviously who is doing the job on the field, like for example, can be an NGO, they will better understand the quality of their job if what they've done is really useful for a successful criminal investigation, so that they can improve. Without this kind of feedbacks, that they will never understand how effective they can be. And obviously, yes, that's a thing that should be probably considered, which is a change in legislation to facilitate a better public-private partnership.
Fabrizio, yes.
Sorry,
yes,
just to jump in there as well. Sorry to jump in, but it may also look at civil asset forfeiture rather than prosecuting someone for money laundering, where the onus is reversed upon a suspect to prove that their wealth hasn't been obtained through criminal activities. Whereas that's probably not a formal law enforcement approach. It's obviously often done by law enforcement agencies. It may also look at that. So using civil asset forfeiture legislation to target the wealth from wildlife traffickers.
Yes, Steve, I agree with you, and the only thing that in this moment really bothers me is the fact that we have reached the conclusion of this webinar, and I would have liked to go much deeper into the discussion. Now we are really getting to some of the key issues, but unfortunately we agreed to try to keep this webinar to 90 minutes. We slightly passed the 90 minutes. I would like to thank sincerely all of you speakers and friends that came here today and enriched this webinar with your knowledge, with your expertise. So I'll give you a virtual applause. Thank you very much for coming. I would like to thank also the audience that participated very actively. I don't know exactly how many people we've had, but last I heard it was quite a lot, certainly more than my friends and family in Sicily, which at the beginning I thought would be the only ones following this webinar. But I thank you really all for showing your interest, for asking these interesting questions. And we will organize more webinars along more or less the same line. So we will try to reach out to you to inform you. A few little questions. You've seen probably at the beginning of this webinar, we showed some information about a law enforcement environmental award that it's currently open. And it's an award that goes to government departments or government officials that have particularly excelled in conducting enforcement operations that successfully impacted on the illegal trade in wildlife or the illicit flow of waste. So if any of you now attending this event know of a government agency or a government official who you think is eligible and qualified to win this award, please consider to apply and nominate your government representative. So that's pretty much it from my side. I really enjoyed it. I thank you very much, and I hope to see you all soon. Oh, last thing they remind me, this event will be available. The recording of this event will be available online on the same link and on the UNODC YouTube channel probably over the next few days. So thank you very much, and enjoy your morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. Thank you.